Alright, so in this video we'll be discussing morality, and we shall be discussing predominantly a workable and a non-workable theory of morality. The first of which is what I call the hierarchical theory, which is workable, and the other of which I call the equalist theory, which is actually unworkable. But it's very prevalent and it's symptomatic of the culture that we have presently, and it's responsible for the culture that we have presently. And I think that most of us, by the end of this consideration at least, will agree that the unworkable one really doesn't work and the culture that we have presently sucks. So let's consider the position of the empathic person as our starting point for moral reasoning. Let's start on a very bright note. As the Hindus attest, this is how the universe starts at every cycle. Everything's good and people understand one another. I like to draw on Hinduism also because there's this notion here that in a way, other is the only thing that there is, and in a way, there is no such thing as an other. And these are two different ways of actually expressing the same notion. The notion is that the distinction that we make between self and other is false, and it begins by differentiating ourselves from the other. So if other is all that exists and self does not exist, this distinction goes away. If other doesn't exist, then this distinction also goes away. But notice that these are just two semantic ways of expressing the same thing. Now, there's a confusion in contemporary society that suggests that actually these are two different paths that lead to the same place. One is serving others in order to get to enlightenment, and the other is serving yourself. But, in fact, these are just verbally two different ways of describing the same basic path. Anyone who drifts from that path is not really taking an alternate path the same way. The person is just working away from that truth. The truth is one that is actually very non-abstract. Although it can be a bit remote to people who don't experience it, and that is one of empathy. The notion is that there's nothing that can be good for you and bad for others. There's nothing that can be bad for you and good for others, because you and other are not different at all. Like, if you walk into a room and you can feel what everyone around you is feeling, I mean, the only problem might be that you might forget what you're feeling. And when people ask you, hey, how is your day going? You might be like, I don't know, you're the one here, right? That's the mentality of the empathic person. The empathic person is one who absorbs everything around oneself. So I can say from my own experience, participating in something like a competitive event, sure, I'll participate in it because other people are participating in it and they might invite me and I want to experience that. But it's very weird for me to win at one of these things or something. I might temporarily feel okay, I'm competent at this. But there's always going to be this problem of well, if I win, I don't feel good about it because I know other people lost. And it feels rather empty. And only if those other people are really happy for me do I really feel happy about my victory. And I'll only really, really feel happy about it if I feel like I've made a change, if I feel like I've made a change for the good. And you can see already how empathy leads us into needing to use things for the good, rather than for our own personal good, because there's no personal good to an empathic person. If I'm victorious and you suffer because of that, I'd be in a schizophrenic trap trying to reconcile my feelings of superiority to your feelings of inferiority to me. And similarly, if I lose, I'd have to reconcile your feelings of superiority, which are good, with my feelings of inferiority, which are bad. And I also have to reconcile with this whole notion that if you don't feel with me about this, how do I reconcile your lack of empathy for me with my excessive empathy for you? The result for this for many empaths is, of course, that they lose any sense of who they are, and they can't even tell what's good for them apart from what's bad for them for a while, and they end up in situations, as I've ended up in, having a medical treatment, which is oftentimes completely absurd. The cause is never actually chemical. It's entirely, outside of the brain. That's the nature of empathy. That you're able to connect with other people who are separate mind bodies. But you can very much imagine how that constant schizophrenia that comes about through living in a capitalistic culture. One of the reasons that there has been this book written called Capitalism and Schizophrenia by these Marxist philosophers. One of them is a psychologist, but you get the idea. This whole schizophrenia of needing to live in a world where every time you win, someone else loses, every time someone else loses, you win, creates this confusion where, you almost forget, which is which, who's winning, who's losing, which is good, which is bad. And it just gets into the situation where you just know that there's like one set of colors and another set of colors. I'm a synesthesiac, so I can think of things in terms of colors. And apparently everyone wants you to work towards one set of them, but you don't really know why, because there's always the other set in the background. That's always the principle. If you're in a competitive culture, but you're an empathic person, you're always going to have that split, that schizophrenic split. The other people won't suffer because they're not empathic, but they're only using half of their minds. Now, the conclusion for this, the way to mediate things, is not by seeking benefit or by seeking detriment for oneself or for others. One is simply seeking what is right. And what is right is a very difficult moral path to follow, but it is also the only conclusion for an empathic person. Now, what is right for me, as I can sum up, is based in the accommodation of others' needs. So that basically means that if I walk into a room full of others, I can always sense what everyone there needs. Now, this leads to an objectivity that other people find threatening because it's not always in accord with their subjectivity. Because even if I'm in a room full of people who are all under my supervision, so to speak, like I'm responsible for how they feel, there might be some people there who don't take that kind of responsibility, and I can feel that coming from them, that they're actually trying to benefit themselves through hurting these other people. And it might actually be that they're benefiting everyone in that room, but at the expense of someone else. Or there's long-term expense to any one individual in that room, because that person now feels dependent upon this one person. Or any one person in that room is only benefiting insofar as it works in with that one individual's agenda. Well, I can't accommodate that individual, so that because that individual is not operating in the greater interests of the group. And incidentally, the greater interest of the group from my mentality always begins with the needs of every individual. The greater interest of the group from that person's mentality is the benefit to that particular individual, and how that particular individual tries to use the dynamics of the group towards one's own purposes. So I hope that that makes sense. That just because you're around an empathic person doesn't mean that that empathic person gives a fuck about you. Because you might actually be obstructing the whole well-being of everyone around you. And that's misconception number one, is that empathic people will always be nice to you. In fact, it's a very narcissistic view of empathy. And it's no mistake, therefore, to note that the narcissist will impose one's own projection of narcissism onto the empath. But if you're an empath, you know you're an empath, and other people know you're an empath. If two people are empathic, can vibe off of one another, they both know that they're empaths. So the question is, what does an empath do? Well, an empath is objective. You have to understand the difference between how an empath experiences the world and how a non-empathic person experiences the world. And oftentimes people who are non-empathic believe themselves to be empathic, but you can still know if you're empathic if you've had enough experience with other empathic people. These are not just people accommodating you. These are not just people telling you that you're right, because they'll corroborate some of the things that you've experienced that other people can't relate to, such as feelings of just sudden dejection, not knowing where it's coming from. This is psychoanalytically considered a depressive symptom, but actually its cause is simply external. It's not internal, and it's not random, it's not chemical. It is actually something that someone else is going through, but if you don't know consciously what that other person's going through, you don't know where it's coming from, right? So the empath's objectivity is this: an empath can never actually hurt anyone unintentionally. The myth is that if you're very good at manipulating people naturally, and this is something that I've noticed in a forum about like people who are Pisces. Like I'm a Pisces myself. We're known as a very for whatever metaphysical physical reasons that astrology gives us, and I'm a believer in these physical reasons, even if I don't understand them. That's another thing about being empathic. You can do that. Pisceans are known, on the one hand, for being very empathic, selfless people. And I've gotten that way before I even believed I was a Pisces. But Pisceans, because back then I wanted to believe that everyone was like that, right? I wanted to believe that everyone was as empathic as I was, even though I kind of knew that that wasn't the case. I tried to at least see that in people. But Pisceans are also accused of being manipulative, because they are able to influence people's emotions in a way because they're so influenced by those emotions, and they try to influence people's emotions towards the benefit of those people and towards the benefit of the people around them. But sometimes the people that they're trying to help and the people that they're trying to influence to help others are egotistical. So what do these egotistical people do? Oh no, this person's trying to supplant my whole ego, my whole will. So this person, by using emotions, this person must be manipulative. And if this person doesn't know it, oh no, that's like a baby given a gun. And it's like, excuse me, let's actually use a little bit more of a constructive metaphor here than comparing me to someone without a lot of competence handling something very dangerous. Emotions can be dangerous, except in the right hands, and the hands of an empathic person are incredibly competent because that person doesn't have ego. If that person's not doing it intentionally, that's because that person's not operating out of self-interest, is not operating out of ego. So really, that person's not hurting you by telling you that you're doing something wrong, that you're doing something that might be destructive, that you're doing something that if you don't abide by my will, is going to have negative consequences. No, that person is holding you responsible. That person is doing one's moral duty, and there's nothing manipulative about that. If that person is not doing it intentionally, then that person has no intent. That is to say, no self-interest, no knowledge of how the ego would even perceive such a thing, because that person's not operating out of the ego. So what you're confronted with is just the truth. And you might not expect that from people. You might not expect people to be sources of truth if you consider yourself to be the only source of truth. But obviously, if you consider yourself to be the only source of truth, you're probably the one who's being narcissistic here. And you're probably the one who's being manipulative without you knowing it, because you haven't acknowledged the other people as anything but a means towards your end. Now, the key thing to understand here is, of course, this thing. And you'll have to excuse me, but I'm just trying to soak in the irony of all of this. What you have to understand is that people. How does one put this? I just need to slow down for a moment to give you a moment to just soak it all in, so I can process where I can follow this up without getting too confusing. People who are empathic, they don't. This is a complicated point, but they don't ever actually hurt you because they don't intend to. See, if I'm empathic and I know what the consequences of my actions or other people's actions will be upon everyone within the vicinity, maybe everyone within maybe even everyone within the town, if I'm empathic enough, and I don't know. I've been told that I can be, but I think that I'd choose against that just for my own sanity, which is a very important goal. Um, if if I wanted to hurt you, and this is something where I have to establish some trust. Like, if I personally wanted to hurt you, I would know that before you did. And by the same token, if you were empathic and you hurt me, I would know that you intended it. The only way that I could let you get away with that and say that it was a mistake is by acknowledging that you're not as empathic as I am. And I have to make that hierarchical distinction for your sake, because otherwise I'd be holding you to my standards. My standards are always going to be my standards. I don't have to put you down to have my standards. But the thing is, if it comes down to either holding you up to my standards or putting you down, I'm going to put you down because my standards are here. That's just a matter of fact. That's not relative to me if I'm operating out of what is in the best interest of the people around me. Now, here's the thing. I would have no reason to harm you if I'm an empath. unless you're harming other people. And if I harm you in the process of just trying to help those other people by refusing to accommodate you in the way that you'd prefer, I'm not harming you intentionally. So in a way, I'm not even hurting you. I'm not even harming you. The person harming you is actually yourself. And that is oftentimes the case with anyone who isolates oneself from other people and says, well, these are my interests and those are other people's. This is what I can do for people. This is what I choose to do for other people. Always, that person is maintaining that gap so that he or she doesn't have to dissolve into everyone around oneself, feel the pain of others, feel the pain that one imposed upon others, and can feel a little bit better than everyone else. See, the difference in an empath's case is that the empath might be better actually in a non-hierarchical way. I express it in a hierarchical way, but it's really not an attempt to one-up everyone else. It's an attempt to be one with everyone else. And it's being obstructed by each one of those individuals to the degree that that individual does not want to be one with everyone else. So ultimately, the healthy mentality, and this is probably another reason why a lot of intellectuals and saints and philosophers and psychologists turn to things like Marxism as opposed to things like capitalism. The greater good, the moral mentality is one which accommodates the needs of everyone else to the degree that those individuals do not fail to accommodate the needs of everyone else. The lower mentality is one of trying to accommodate one's own needs through placing limitations upon other people. In fact, the only reason that you would need to accommodate your own needs without accommodating other people's needs, the only reason you would need to focus on yourself primarily is in order to put everyone else down. So it's a natural conclusion that a person who's self-interested will try to hold other people in one's own debt when one might not actually be the person who needs helping. Like, you might need to help someone and that person might never get the chance to help you back because that person needs to help someone else. Of course, if that person is really not out helping other people, that person's guilty conscience will sooner or later show. And if you're an empathic, altruistic person, you know that. But here you see that there are two worlds. There's the world of helping others and there's the world of service to self. Now, in the past, we described the dissolution of other, the elimination of other, and the elimination of self as being two sides of the same coin. What we don't want to confuse this with is this duality, because those two sides of the same coin are just two different ways of expressing the same transformation, and both of them arrive up here. But the person who insists that, no, these are really very different paths leading to the same place, that they're different mentalities, is actually operating out of a lower mentality, a lower frequency. And this is a problem also of what is called Satanism. Satanism insists that service to self is equal to service to others. Well, no. The idea is that other is illusory and self is illusory, and you can get to the unity by either eliminating the self or eliminating the other. But serving yourself is perpetuating yourself. Similarly, serving the other is perpetuating the other. And it's true that Satanists and altruists are oftentimes on the same level. That's because altruists aren't necessarily empaths. Satanists are not empaths. But there is this empathic dimension above both of them. And both being altruistic without really knowing what people want, not knowing what people need, and being satanic and just saying, well, I don't care what other people need. Both of those are on a lower level altogether. They're on an immoral level, which will always create conflict. And I will explain how it creates conflict. But I will explain that from the perspective of someone who's on this lower level and how that person conceives the world. See, here we have this hierarchical moral conception, but there's a vertical moral conception according to which we are all equal. Sounds great, right? Actually, it turns out to be totally wrong. If we're all equal, then that means that no one is at liberty to judge anyone else as being wrong. No one is at liberty to say, hey, what you're doing is messing up your life and it will probably mess up the lives of everyone else around you. So what do we do then? We establish a different system which overlaps now with this one, even though we might not know that it's overlapping because we consider our system to be the only one that's right, that's just. because it's the only one that's ironically supposed to be not right and not just, but just it doesn't make that pretense. So the idea is it's a hard contradiction to wrap one's head around unless one's been around this kind of person for a long enough time. The idea is that, well, all moral preaching is hypocrisy. But if I admit towards being a hypocrite, then I'm less of one. It's like this notion that all moral preaching is an attempt to one-up people, but I can one-up everyone else by saying I'm not one-ing them up at all, and that is, in fact, passive aggression. Now, the way that this chart looks is not like there's right on top and wrong on the bottom, but rather that there's what I want here and what I don't want here. Now, this creates some problems, of course. Because after a while, what I don't want is equated with what other people want, and I'm in constant conflict, and I feel the need to accommodate other people, but only insofar as they can accommodate me. Now that means that my main focus is to accommodate me, so I'm probably not going to accommodate other people very well. I'll be tempted to exploit them. Remember that this kind of chart is only necessary to a person who is self-interested. An altruistic person doesn't need this chart because by altruistic I mean altruistic in the empathic sense, not the altruist from the perspective of the Satanist, but I mean really, a really altruistic empathic person doesn't need this sort of chart because there's no real difference between what an empathic altruist wants and what an empathic altruist needs. And sorry if I'm redefining my terms. I'm using altruist now in the grander sense of an empathic altruist. Yes, these people are altruistic. They're just not altruistic in the sense that we introduced the term, which is as the analog to Satanists, right? There's how Satanists view altruism, and there's a group of people about whom Satanists are right, but then there's this higher group of people who are empathic about whom Satanists are wrong. But I'm just developing these terms as I go along because I'm trying to be as forthcoming with you as possible. So the thing about it is that this whole system of dividing what you want from what other people want is always aimed at the perpetuation of the self. We've already established that. And here's the issue. You see, I'm operating up here at what's right, and you're kind of tending towards down here with what's wrong, but you're trying to operate over here with what's with what you want, and you're also trying to accommodate what I want or what you think I want, which is sometimes what you don't want. Now, sometimes what I do right will appear in this quadrant of what you want, right? But sometimes it'll appear in this quadrant of what you don't want. That's actually fair, because, in either case, I'm doing something right. Maybe half the time it's what you like, half the time it's not what you like, but you can compromise, right? And if what you don't like is conceived of as what I want, then that's fine. Like half the time we're doing what I want, half the time we're doing what you want, but all the time we're doing what's right. At least that's from my perspective, if I'm operating morally. But there's a problem from your perspective, because you see, from your perspective, whenever I'm operating in this quadrant, you're accommodating my needs, which means that I have to accommodate your needs. Now, in fact, I do accommodate your needs. That's my whole principle. I will oftentimes be operating in this quadrant where what you want is in accord with what's right. But that's not always, you don't always see it that way. Why? Because you sometimes operate in this quadrant down here, which is what you think I want, which is not what you want, but it's actually not what I want, because it's wrong. You think that you're accommodating people around them by offering them, I don't know, drugs or money, or offering them something which it doesn't really belong to you technically, or doesn't belong to you in the highest sense. You might be taking them away from their comfort zone into a realm that's not really healthy for you or for anyone else, but you might feel like they owe that to you. And they might accommodate you at first by by saying, well, I guess you need this, so let's try it. But after a while, they might stop accommodating you and say, well, this is harmful. This is harmful to me, and it's also harmful to you. And out of defensiveness, you might say, no, 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 I did this for you. You owe me consideration. You owe me respect. And because they think that they've done so much for you that you have to do that now for them. And oftentimes, what they want you to do for them is also down here, it's immoral. And you can't do that for them because it's immoral. You'd be accommodating them at their expense, at your expense, and at the expense of other people. Now, it's troublesome trying to communicate with this person because you have to convince this person that they owe you something in order to get this person to do anything right at all. But in fact, you know that the whole principle of debt is immoral. So you're in a kind of a double bind. The key thing is to remember that this person is ultimately destructive to other people, so you don't really need to be as considerate of this person's feelings as you need to be considerate of other people's feelings, because if you're too considerate of this person's feelings, then this person will create problems for other people and will not even know it, or will not even acknowledge it. Now let's look at how this person views your perspective, because you might give this person your perspective as an honest to God thing, and this person will dismiss it. Because from this person's perspective, what you consider right is simply what you want. What you consider wrong is simply what you don't want. And from this person's perspective, what he considers, what he prefers is what he wants. Not what is right, but simply what he wants. And what he prefers is what he doesn't want. So the ideal here is for both of you to operate in this quadrant where both of you get what you want. But it's very rare that this person will actually strive for this quadrant. Usually, what this person will do is will strive towards this quadrant, which is what he does not want, but what you want, ostensibly. You like this because this occurs within the realm, obviously, of what he's defined as what you want, what you've defined as what is good. And it's not what he wants, but it's good, so it's by definition right. But then this person says, well, now we have to even the score because that's fair. Now, really, there's no greater good here operating according to which to determine whether it's fair or not. But it's such a meme, it's become such a meme now, that the notion is, let's avenge ourselves. Now, this person's trying to drag you down to this corner over here. And this person's saying, okay, now I've done for you what I did not want to do for you. Now you have to do for me what you don't want to. It's basically saying, you have to compromise your morals for me because I did something right that was uncomfortable for me. Obviously, you can't do that, and that hurts this person. You can only serve this person in a way that accommodates your morals. The person knows that that's accommodating your morals. This person considers it not fair because then you're getting what you want. He's still getting what he wants, but you're not making the kind of sacrifice that he's making. Now, obviously, the ideal is to be up in this corner. The ideal, even from his own perspective, is to be getting what both of you want. The problem is that sometimes you still need to act out what is right, and it's not what this person wants. And this person feels insulted. This person feels like one wrong term deserves another. The way to set this right is by making you surrender your values to his will. And this is where the whole system begins to fall apart. Because now, instead of striving for this box up here, this person is striving for this box down here. Or these two boxes. Doing what he wants just because he wants it. And actually, ultimately, this gets to the point where he's doing things to try to accommodate you in order to influence you, and you're trying to do things to accommodate him in order to influence him to just be a better person, and you both wind up in this box where neither of you gets what either of you wants, but you're in a codependent relationship. And the reason for that is that you've fallen into the realm of the selfish altruist, and that's where he was to begin with. When he was trying to accommodate you, he was really doing it with the hope that it'll benefit him. And that's what Satanists find to be at fault with false altruists. But what was forgotten in all of this is this realm up here. That this realm up here was never actually what you wanted. It was what everyone else needed. And there's no way in which his point of view can actually work unless you constantly accommodate him and you ignore this box up here. You ignore this box up here where he has to accommodate what's right even though he doesn't like it. But if you ignore that, he's not going to recognize the value, the objective value of this higher dimension. So he's oftentimes going to accommodate himself without accommodating you. So he's going to be operating out of this box down here, and that's going to wind you up down here as well. Because to the degree that you accommodate him, and that both of you get what you want, you're still allowing him to operate out of self-interest. Now, from his perspective, this obviously creates a zero-sum game where either you are operating out of this box, or he's operating out of this box, or you both are trying to operate out of these boxes and you both wind up in this box. But all of this is eliminated when you realize that any one person can operate out of this set of values up here. It's not morality is not ultimately relative. Morality is ultimately universal. If it's based in not the ego, not in trying to perpetuate self-gain, but what it's actually based in is trying to accommodate everyone, which means that you get out of relativism, you get into pluralism. You what's up here is not what I want, it's what everyone needs. And we can all strive towards that. The egoist will always be inclined towards what he wants and will always oppress the other people around him. Because he either forces them to compromise their values, or he doesn't live up to their standards. And here's the thing. If he's living down here and you're living up here, everything's going towards him, everything's going his way, but you're not necessarily accommodating other people in the process. To the degree that you owe anything to one person who doesn't really need it, to the degree that you feel that debt towards that person, you're bound to that person. You can't help other people. And that person can go on harming other people or harming himself, operating in this lower box here, and you can't do anything about it. So the whole system of self-interest falls apart. And it's naive because he claims to know what it is that you want. But really, from the very outset, he knows what he wants, he knows what he doesn't want. He doesn't actually know what you want. You might not want anything. You might be free of desire. You might just be a perfect moral agent. And what you do, however selfish it might appear, might be just totally natural. You might benefit from the benefit of others. But your system never says these are my desires. It says this is what I would prefer because it's right. So what he presumes is that this up here is what you want. But his chart actually already has defined what you want as what he doesn't want. he only has available to him really his chart. He doesn't see that there's a bigger picture, a higher way of doing things as opposed to a lower way of doing things. He only knows what he wants and what he doesn't want. And ultimately, if that's all that he sees, um, he has to conclude that what he doesn't want is what you want, and that is why he's always trying to even the score between the two of you. Or if he's more sophisticated, he can imagine that what you consider to be right is what you want, and what you consider to be wrong is what is what you don't want, and he could try to accommodate what you want while accommodating what he wants, and kind of and kind of trying to eliminate this quadrant, which is what neither of you want. But that will always fail, as we've described. This model fails. So the model that is substituted for it, inevitably, is that for him, what he doesn't want is what you want. There's an ultimate zero-sum game, and he's not even paying attention anymore to this hierarchical dynamic of right and wrong. So the conclusion here is that we have to make the transition. We have to make the transition from trying to accommodate other people's desires for our own benefit and our own desires. And we have to grow up. And we have to acknowledge that there is an objective moral good. And we do that by training our empathy, or by listening to people who have more natural empathy than we do. We have to kind of eliminate that conceited egalitarianism that says that we're all equal to the degree that we're all selfish, and acknowledge that there are people out there who are relatively selfless, who suffer a lot and get screwed over a lot, and don't deserve that because they're doing it for other people. They're not doing it for themselves. So you have to stop accusing them of that self-interest, because actually from the outset, the notion of what the other wants is really just a fabrication of what you want. It was from the very beginning the category of what you don't want. From the very beginning, your T-chart was what I want and what I don't want, and it was also what I want and what other people want, and what I don't want is equated with what other people want. So if other people come in here and say, this is what's right, that you have to say, oh, that's just what you want, as opposed to what you don't want. And you can pretend that that's not that's not an extrapolation from what you don't want, that you're not equating what you don't want with what others want, that there is actually all this subtlety here. There's what we both want, what neither of us want, what you want and I don't want, what I want and you don't want. But as we've pointed out, this way of thinking falls apart. And it's a cycle, because afterwards the egoist is always left with a situation where what he doesn't want is also what other people want, and he has to fight with them. He tries to level with them, and then he ultimately has to fight with them, and that's always going to be destructive to the whole altruistic project, the empathic project. So I hope that that's not too much to take in. And that becomes the start for the next cycle of delusion, because then when someone else comes in and says, well, this is how I want things to be, he says, this is how this other person wants things to be. It's not righteous. Or that person might say, oh, this is what I prefer, or this is what's right. And it says, that's what that person wants. That's not what I want. I have to figure out a way to get what I want from this person. And I set this up by pretending to be all diplomatic and shit, and saying, and saying we're gonna have 4 quadrants: what mutual self-interest, mutual destruction, and your advantage and my advantage. But always the presumption upon the other person's desires begins with one's own fears, with the things that oneself does not prefer. It begins with this quadrant, with this basic duality of this is what I want, this is what I don't want. And that is always a selfish accusation. And ultimately, um, it's unfair if you look at it from the four quadrants, because that means that ultimately all three of these quadrants are actually, theoretically, what the other person wants. And only this quadrant is what you want. And this quadrant is, remember, from my perspective, you benefiting immorally. So that might seem a bit complicated, but that's just psychology for you. I mean, when you're dealing with egoists, things get complicated, but the solution is simple. When other people come up to you and say, "This is what I want," hooray! Congratulations! That's what you want too, because you put others first. And the only exception to this is when that other person is not accommodating the wants, which are in fact the needs of other people. And those wants are only exempt from being needs if that person is failing to accommodate the needs of other people. And all that seems like just an infinite regression, like we'll never really figure out what a true need is. But if you're empathic, if you don't really make a distinction between yourself and your well-being and that of others, then it's the easiest thing in the world. There's no complication there between what I want and what the other wants. And so I don't have to accuse other people of harboring desires in the way that I harbor desires. I can just work with them towards an objective good, because if there's no fundamental difference between self and other, well, nothing's really relative. Everything's absolute. Pain is pain. Glory is glory. And what I experience as glory is glory. What I experience as pain is pain. There is no other that can contradict me. And there's no self that I can be accused of. So there you go.